On the afternoon of the 15th of March, 1783, George Washington walked into a log building his own soldiers had built with their own hands, a hall they had nicknamed the Temple of Virtue, and every officer inside that room turned to look at him with something close to shock, because none of them had expected him to come. The hall was crowded, benches filled with men who had spent the better part of a decade in uniform, the air thick with tension that had been building for weeks rather than days. They had gathered to discuss what to do about a government that had betrayed them, and some of the men in that room were seriously considering using the most powerful army on the continent to make Congress pay. At the front of the room, a rival general was already preparing to take charge of the meeting, a man whose ambitions ran in a very different direction than Washington's own. Washington was not supposed to be part of that conversation. He arrived anyway, and in the next 15 minutes, using nothing but a piece of paper, a pair of glasses, and his own voice, he did something almost no successful general in human history had ever done before him. He talked his own army out of taking power. Ask yourself a question most people never think to ask about the founding of the United States. The Revolutionary War ends. An army of battle-hardened veterans has just defeated the most powerful empire on earth, and that army is angry, unpaid, and armed. Historically, what happens next? Look at almost any other revolution in almost any other era, and the answer is depressingly consistent. The generals who win the war become the men who run the country afterward, whether the country wants them to or not. Cromwell's new model army didn't go home quietly after the English Civil War. It dissolved Parliament by force. A century and a half later, the armies that won the French Revolution would hand the country to a general named Napoleon. Even in the 20th century, the pattern repeats itself with grim consistency across dozens of newly independent nations, where the military that fought for liberation simply refuses to relinquish the power it earned on the battlefield, arguing, not always wrongly, by its own logic, that it alone had paid the price required to govern. So, why didn't it happen here? Why did the victorious Continental Army, sitting in a camp in New York in the spring of 1783, hungry, unpaid, and led by men who had every practical justification to march on Philadelphia, simply not do it? The answer is a 15-minute speech, and the answer is one man who understood something about power that almost nobody who has ever held real military authority has been willing to understand. To see why this moment came so close to going the other way, you have to understand who these officers actually were and what they had actually been through. These were not disgruntled recruits looking for an excuse to cause trouble. Many of them had been in uniform for 7 or 8 straight years, since the earliest days of the war. Men who had frozen at Valley Forge, bled at Monmouth, marched hundreds of miles on rotting shoes, and watched friends die for a cause that had, on paper, already won. Some of these officers had left behind farms, businesses, and families as young men, and were returning home, if they returned home at all, as strangers to their own children, with nothing to show for 8 years, except a body full of old wounds, and a government that seemed increasingly indifferent to whether they lived or starved. They were proud men, professional soldiers by this point, rather than the amateur militia companies that had started the war. Men who had turned themselves through sheer repetition and hardship into one of the most capable fighting forces on the planet. A transformation few of the politicians safely debating policy in Philadelphia had ever had to survive themselves. And pride matters enormously to understanding what almost happened next, because pride, wounded by ingratitude, curdles into something far more dangerous than simple hunger. And what had that cause given them in return? By the winter of 1782 and into 1783, many officers had gone months, in some cases years, without receiving their promised pay at all. Worse, back in 1780, the Continental Congress had made a formal promise, a lifetime pension at half pay for officers once they were honorably discharged, a pledge meant to keep experienced commanders from walking away from the army in the middle of the war. That promise had never been funded. The Congress, operating under the Articles of Confederation, had no power to tax directly. It could only ask the individual states to voluntarily send money, and the states, increasingly convinced the war was basically over and eager to save money, simply weren't sending it. In late 1782, a group of officers had even formally petitioned Congress, laying out their case plainly and warning, without quite saying it outright, that patience inside the army was not unlimited. Congress had responded by forming a committee to study the matter, which produced sympathetic language and no actual funding. Exactly the kind of response that convinces men who have already sacrificed everything. That polite process is simply another word for being ignored. So here is the position these officers found themselves in as peace with Britain approached. They had won, and winning, for them personally, appeared to mean going home broke, unpaid, and abandoned by the very government they had bled for. That resentment did not stay quiet, and it did not stay purely military either. Inside the Congress itself, a group of men historians now call the Nationalists, including Alexander Hamilton, Robert Morris, and Gouverneur Morris, looked at the army's growing anger and saw something useful. These men believed, correctly as it turned out eventually, that the weak, decentralized government under the Articles of Confederation could not survive, that it needed real taxing power to function as a nation at all, and they had been trying for years to convince the individual states to grant Congress that authority, without success. And they recognized that an angry, unpaid army sitting outside Philadelphia was, as one of them put it privately, a powerful engine that could be used to pressure the states into finally funding a stronger central government. It was a cynical calculation dressed up as patriotism, using the very real suffering of soldiers as leverage in a political fight that had nothing to do with those soldiers' actual well-being. Hamilton himself wrote to Washington in February of 1783, essentially suggesting that Washington take charge of the officers' discontent. Get out in front of it. Use it as leverage. Washington read that letter and refused. He told Hamilton flatly that the grievances of his men were legitimate, but that he would not manipulate that anger for political ends, that doing so was beneath the cause they had all fought for. He wrote back that unless Congress had the power to govern effectively, everything the army had sacrificed over 8 years of war would ultimately be for nothing, but that the answer to that problem could never be a threat of force from the very institution meant to embody restraint. His old friend and artillery chief, Henry Knox, gave the nationalist politicians the exact same answer when they came to him with a similar idea, telling them plainly that the army's loyalty would never be turned against the liberties it had spent 8 years defending. But the temptation didn't disappear just because Washington and Knox said no. It simply found a different general to attach itself to. That general was Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, a man with a legitimate battlefield reputation of his own and a long, well-known personal rivalry with Washington that stretched back years, including quiet whispers during the war that Gates himself might make a better commander-in-chief. Gates had never quite made peace with living in Washington's shadow, and in the winter of 1783, with the war winding down and the possibility of a decisive command opportunity closing forever, the frustration of the officer corps around him presented something he may not have consciously planned for, but was clearly willing to let unfold. In early March of 1783, an anonymous letter began circulating through the officer camp at Newburgh, almost certainly written by Major John Armstrong Jr., an aide serving under Gates, though the full authorship has always been debated by historians. The letter was inflammatory by design, written with real literary skill, clearly the work of an educated man who understood exactly which grievances to press and which words would cut deepest. It accused Congress of trampling on the soldiers' rights, of stringing them along with empty promises for years, and it floated a genuinely dangerous ultimatum. If the war continued, the letter suggested, maybe the army should simply refuse to fight anymore until it was paid. And if peace was declared instead, maybe the army should refuse to disband at all, take its weapons somewhere beyond the reach of a government that had betrayed it, and let the civilians who had failed them fend for themselves. It called for an unauthorized meeting of officers the very next day to discuss exactly these options. This was not a peaceful petition. This was, functionally, the opening move of a mutiny against civilian government, dressed up in the language of grievance, and it spread through the camp with the speed of any document that tells exhausted, angry men exactly what they already wanted to hear. Washington found out about the letter and the planned meeting almost immediately, and he made his first critical decision. He did not ignore it, and he did not simply forbid it either, both of which would have looked like exactly the kind of high-handed dismissal the anonymous letter was accusing Congress of, and either move risked pushing the officers further into Gates's orbit rather than pulling them back. Instead, on March 11th, he issued general orders condemning the unauthorized meeting as improper while simultaneously announcing that he himself would call an official meeting of the senior officers a few days later, on March 15th, to discuss the Army's grievances properly. It was a brilliant piece of political maneuvering disguised as simple procedure. He took the moment away from the conspirators and rescheduled it under his own authority, buying himself 4 critical days to plan exactly how he intended to walk into that room and what he intended to say. And crucially, he did not initially announce that he intended to attend himself. Many of the officers in that camp genuinely believed their commander-in-chief would stay away from the March 15th meeting entirely, which some of them took as a silent signal that Washington was, at minimum, not going to stand in their way. A second anonymous letter circulated in the days between the 11th and the 15th. This one claiming that Washington's own actions and words showed quiet support for the officer's cause, an attempt to drag his name and reputation into the conspiracy whether he liked it or not, and it only deepened his resolve to appear in person and settle, unmistakably, exactly where he stood. They were wrong, and this is the moment worth pausing on, because everything that saved the American Republic that afternoon depended on a piece of writing and a piece of theatre executed almost perfectly. This channel exists to break down exactly these turning points, the ones where a single decision by a single person quietly determines what kind of country gets built afterward. So if that's the kind of history that grips you, subscribe now, because we're just getting to the moment that mattered most. On the afternoon of March 15th, the officers gathered in the Temple of Virtue, the large hall they themselves had constructed for meetings and gatherings at the New Windsor cantonment near Newburgh. The mood in the room was not celebratory. It was tense, resentful, and primed for exactly the kind of defiant unity the anonymous letter had been engineered to produce. Horatio Gates, as the senior officer present, moved to the front of the room to open the proceedings. And then the door opened, and George Washington walked in. The room went still. Washington asked Gates for permission to address the gathering, a small but deliberate courtesy that immediately reasserted, without a single confrontational word, exactly whose authority still governed that room, and it forced Gates himself, standing at the front, to publicly grant his rival the floor in front of every officer whose loyalty was in question. Then he began to speak, and his opening lines did not plead or apologize. They confronted the letter and the unauthorized meeting directly. "Gentlemen," he said, "by an anonymous summons, an attempt has been made to convene you together. How inconsistent with the rules of propriety, how unmilitary, and how subversive of all order and discipline." He named the danger plainly, refusing to soften what was actually being proposed in that room. He reminded them that he had shared every hardship of this war alongside them, sleeping in the same frozen camps, eating the same short rations, that no man in that army had a deeper claim to frustration with Congress than he did, having given 8 uninterrupted years without pay himself, and having refused, publicly, any salary for his service as commander. And yet he told them clearly that the anonymous letter's proposed course, refusing to fight or refusing to disband, threatened to drown the glory of 8 years of sacrifice in an act that history would remember as treason rather than principle. He asked them to consider what kind of nation they would be founding if its first act of self-government was an army turning its bayonets on the very Congress it had bled to establish. And what enemy of American liberty could possibly hope for a better outcome than that? It was a serious, carefully constructed argument, delivered by the one man in the room whose own sacrifices could not be questioned. But arguments alone were not what broke the room. What broke the room happened almost by accident. Partway through his remarks, Washington reached into his coat for a letter from a congressman, meant to reassure the officers that their cause was not forgotten in Philadelphia, and he began to read it aloud. He stumbled over the words, squinting at the page in the dim light of the hall and the room, watching a general who had never once appeared uncertain in front of them for 8 years of war, saw him falter for the first time any of them could remember. It was such a small thing, a man having trouble reading a letter, and yet in that room, in that moment, it landed like a thunderclap, because Washington had spent 8 years being the one fixed point of composure these men could measure their own fear against, and composure was cracking in front of them. And then Washington reached into his pocket and pulled out something almost none of these men had ever seen him wear in public before, a pair of reading glasses. He paused, and as he put them on, he said quietly that the men would have to forgive him, that he had grown grey in their service, and now found himself growing blind in it as well. It is difficult to overstate what that single, unscripted sentence did to that room. These were hardened combat officers, men who had watched friends die in the snow at Valley Forge without flinching, men who prided themselves on a kind of stoic, professional endurance that 8 years of war had hammered into them. And multiple accounts describe them openly weeping at the sight of their commander, humbled, aging, admitting a physical toll that mirrored exactly the sacrifice they believed had gone unrecognized in themselves. In one gesture, Washington had turned the argument from an abstract debate about pensions and back pay into something entirely personal. He was not a distant authority, lecturing them about propriety. He was an old soldier, just like them, who had given just as much as they had, maybe more, and was asking them, one exhausted veteran to another, not to throw it all away in the final chapter. There is something almost unbearably human about the image. A man in his 50s who looked older, whose eyesight really had begun to fail after a decade of reading dispatches by candlelight in freezing tents, standing in front of the very men who might have followed him into a coup, and disarming them not with authority, but with the plain, unforced fact of his own exhaustion. Washington finished his remarks and left the hall without waiting to see the result. A final piece of theatre that denied the room the chance to argue back to his face, and denied Gates, still standing near the front, any opening to rally a counter-argument while emotions were still raw. What followed in the minutes after his departure was almost anticlimactic by comparison, which was exactly the point. Officers who moments earlier had been primed for defiance now moved, overwhelmingly, in the opposite direction. Henry Knox and other senior officers loyal to Washington guided the room toward a formal resolution, working the crowd the way any experienced leader manages a room that has just had its emotional temperature completely reset, and it passed without serious opposition. The officers voted to express confidence in Congress's intention to eventually do justice by the Army, and they explicitly rejected the language and the proposals of the anonymous letters that had started the entire crisis. Gates himself, whatever his private ambitions had been, had no realistic path forward once the room turned, and he offered no resistance to the resolution that effectively buried the conspiracy he had allowed to grow around him. The conspiracy, such as it was, collapsed in that room, in the space of perhaps 20 minutes, undone not by force, not by arrests, not by threats, but by a 15-minute speech and a pair of glasses. The aftermath moved quickly once the political pressure of a defiant army evaporated. Washington wrote to Congress within days, forwarding the resolution and assuring the government that the unrest was over, framing what had happened as one final proof of the Army's patriotism rather than as a crisis narrowly avoided. A piece of diplomatic generosity that protected the reputations of officers who might otherwise have faced serious consequences for what had, in plain terms, been the beginning of a mutiny. Congress, no longer facing the threat of an armed and furious officer corps, finally acted on a problem it had been dodging for years. Rather than the disputed lifetime pension at half pay that had never been funded in the first place, Congress agreed to a compromise, granting officers 5 years of full pay as a lump settlement, along with a partial resolution of the back pay that had been owed for months and years. It was not everything the officers had originally been promised. Many still went home to farms and businesses that had suffered badly in their absence, still carrying debts the settlement did not fully cover. But it was real, it was funded, and it came without a single shot fired against the government they had spent 8 years defending, which was, in the end, the only outcome that actually mattered. There is an old parallel for what almost happened at Newburgh, and it comes from the very civilization the founders modeled their republic on. When the Roman Republic's armies grew powerful enough to make or break the state, the men who commanded them eventually stopped going home quietly. Julius Caesar, at the head of a loyal and battle-hardened legion, chose to cross the Rubicon rather than disband as the Senate ordered. And the republic he crossed that river to save ended up dying because of the choice he made instead, replaced within a generation by an empire ruled by emperors instead of elected magistrates. The pattern repeated itself again and again across the centuries in nearly every society that fought a long, exhausting war and then found itself with a battle-hardened army and a weak civilian government sitting side by side. Oliver Cromwell's new model army, having won the English Civil War for Parliament, did not simply disband when the fighting stopped. It eventually turned its bayonets on the very Parliament it had fought for. dissolving it by force when Cromwell judged its members insufficiently useful to his purposes. A century and a half after Newburgh, the exhausted, victorious armies of revolutionary France would hand their loyalty to a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, who used that loyalty first to seize power and eventually to crown himself emperor. Washington stood, in the spring of 1783, in almost the exact position Caesar had stood in more than 18 centuries earlier, commanding an army more powerful than the civilian government that technically controlled it, an army with genuine grievances and the physical means to act on them. The difference between the two men is the entire difference between a republic that survives and a republic that becomes something else. Caesar crossed his river. Washington chose to disband his legions and go home to his farm instead, a decision so startling to European observers that when King George III was told Washington intended to give up power once the war was won, he reportedly said that if Washington actually did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. The habits formed at Newburgh did not stay confined to that one afternoon in New York. 6 years later, when Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States under the new Constitution, the precedent he had set in that log hall was already baked into the character of the office, and it shaped decisions far beyond that single inauguration. When Washington chose, after 2 terms as president, to voluntarily walk away from power rather than serve for life the way so many advisors quietly hoped he would, he was drawing on the exact same instinct he had shown at Newburgh, the belief that no man, however trusted, however loved by the soldiers or the public, should be allowed to become larger than the government he served. Military force answers to civilian government, not the other way around. It is a principle so deeply assumed in American life today that most people never think about it at all, never consider that it was not guaranteed, that it had to be chosen, deliberately, by a man who had every tool available to choose differently, at the one moment when choosing differently would have been easiest to justify and hardest to stop. It is worth sitting with how narrow that margin actually was. There was no law compelling Washington to disband the army rather than use it. There was no institution powerful enough to stop him if he had decided that afternoon in the Temple of Virtue to simply let the anger in that room run its course. The Confederation Congress had no standing army of its own to counter him with, no police force capable of arresting a general, commanding thousands of veteran soldiers loyal to him personally, above any government. Everything that stopped the United States from being born as a military dictatorship, or fracturing into chaos the way so many revolutions before and after it did, came down to the character of one exhausted man choosing, in a single afternoon, not to take what was sitting in front of him for the taking. Historians still debate the precise motivations of everyone involved, whether Gates truly intended a coup or was simply outmaneuvered by more radical men around him, whether the Nationalists in Congress were cynically exploiting the army's suffering or genuinely trying to save the fragile Union. But none of that debate changes the outcome. A republic that could easily have ended the way almost every other revolution in history had ended, instead survived its most dangerous internal moment, because its commanding general looked at the army that trusted him completely and chose, deliberately, to hand that trust back to the civilians it belonged to. Every peaceful transfer of power that followed, every general who retired quietly instead of seizing the government he served, traces back in some meaningful way to a single afternoon when George Washington put on a pair of glasses in front of his own officers and asked them to remember who they actually were. If you want more of these hinge moments in history, the ones that never make it into the textbook chapter headings, but quietly decided what kind of world came next, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments what you think would have happened to America if Washington had made the opposite choice that day.